Well, this is a lot better because I didn't know that I would be able to. I didn't know that I'd be able to use Zoom. What a relief. God, I didn't know that I'd be able to use Zoom. What a relief. I didn't know that I'd be able to use. Right, so I've got Twitch open over there. I don't know why I can't see it properly, but I dare say it's working. And now I get to find out whether this actually now I get to find out whether the audio will be better, because yesterday I did a Twitch and the audio didn't seem to be very good, but normally on Zoom it's quite good. So what am I going to do? Today I am going to do the second of the things that I started yesterday by kind of, or the day before, by accident, which is writing a review on Amazon of a book that I like. That sounds, I'm sure, to some people, not like the most amazingly exciting thing, but to be honest, I'm not sure that I can get my head around some of the other things that some people do on Twitch, and there may be an audience somewhere for one person in the whole universe who wants to watch me writing book reviews on Amazon. And I'm doing this because, a quick recap, I have my own book out. It's called Psalms for the City, and I'm very pleased with it and proud of it. It's got lots of my own drawings in it and my poems, and you can see that I'm not 14 years old, but when I was 14 I wanted to be an artist, and when I was about 21 I wanted to be a poet. Now here I am publishing proper books of art and poetry. It's actually my 7th book, but it's the first one that I've illustrated with 50 colour drawings. Some of my other drawings. But what prompted me to do this book review on Amazon is someone reviewed my book and gave it 1 star, which was a bit annoying, and it wasn't like the end of the world or anything, but it did annoy me at the time, and I was trying to work out what to do to feel less annoyed, and it occurred to me that maybe I could do some kind of good karma by going online somewhere and posting a positive review for someone else's book. So anyway, that's what I'm going to do again. This is book number 2, and it's this book, 52 Ways of Looking at a Poem, because my book is not just illustrations, but poetry. The last book I reviewed was all about illustrations. And I've never reviewed this book, but I'm going to, so I'll tell you a little bit about it. And in the back of the book, you can see I've made a little list of other books that I want to review in the next few days or weeks, however long this goes on. So I'm already starting to think about that. And you can see that in my copy of the book, I've made red underlinings of things that I really like. And so I suppose that will give me a sense of what I want to talk about. But first I want to talk about how I actually came across this book. This is 52 Ways of Looking at a Poem. What Ruth Padel does is go through 52 particular poems by particular individual poets, and it's kind of like all books like this, all anthologies are kind of a fossil. As soon as they come out, they're a snapshot of how things were at that time, and I can't quite remember when this book was published. Let's have a look. 2004, and I didn't get it till quite some time after. You might also be able to see that my own edition is a bit knackered. It actually fell in the bath, believe it or not. Well, why wouldn't you believe it? It did fall in the bath, and so that was a bit more than a bit annoying. However, it's remained a much loved book for me, and I want to explain how I came across it. So I did English literature and studied poetry and loved poets and poetry. And the truth is that when I was there weren't that many women poets, and it didn't even occur to me particularly that there weren't that many women poets. It may have crossed my mind briefly, not that much. I just thought, these are the poets that we study, great, and fine. And I liked them, some of them, and some of them I didn't. And then I was in an Airbnb in about 2014 or 15. Of course, by then I had come across quite a number of women poets. But what really stunned me was in this Airbnb, which was owned by a professional writer like me, but a different one, someone I don't know, he had tons of books. And the books on his shelves included tons of poetry, which, so I looked through lots of his poetry books. And a lot of his poetry books were exactly the same as my ones, the ones that I had studied, and exact same edition. And I thought, well, okay, this is someone just like me. And then I came across this book and I flicked through it and I thought, wow, that's amazing. Look, it just really, really hit me. There are loads of women poets. And I thought, why didn't I know that before? And I'm quite conscious when I'm saying this, I'm a man, like, why should I care? Well, I have a daughter, I have a wife, I have a sister and a mother, and it just occurred to me that I'd missed out. I thought, this is really interesting, different voice. If you can hear my dog barking, that's another different voice. Not very interesting, but it's another voice. So I just thought, what a wonderful thing to have all these different worldviews. I like the men's poems as well, but I just thought, gosh, I never even knew about this. So I got really excited. I get excited when I find something new and like, what am I going to learn from this? So I suppose I'll say something about that when I write my Amazon review. This seems to be what I do in these live streams. I just talk about stuff and work out in advance what I think about it, whether or not anyone is listening. So the poems that really, the things that really leap out to me if I think about this book are the longish introduction about kind of what is the point of poetry? Why would anyone care? And she, the author, Ruth Padel, who's a poet and has worked as a journalist, particularly writing about poetry. She used to have a column in the newspaper. I think it was The Independent on Sunday. Yep. And she would write about a poem every week. And so this is obviously a collection of those. And what she does in this introduction is talk really, I think, fascinatingly about why poetry does certain things at certain times and what motivates poets to work that way, and why do we sometimes have poets who have to kind of smuggle their political thoughts out there, like in the Soviet era, and how do we give it shape? How do we make it entertaining? And all of those sorts of things. It just gets really exciting. So when she talks about how poetry works, she says they're tools, not rules. You can do whatever you like, basically, but here are some of the tools that you can use when you're reading and therefore writing poetry. And so she goes through a number of things about how the poem makes sense, about how we make shape and give some sort of structure just by using sound effects that might make something seem more coherent, because if it echoes and rhymes, then it seems like it was meant to be in a way that it might not otherwise if there's no obvious pattern. She gives a historical overview of how poetry develops quite quickly. She goes through that. And then she talks about things that have happened in fairly recent time. So like she talks about how rhyming has become much more subtle. So it's almost not noticeable because it's only half rhyme or imperfect rhyme. So she gives some examples of those sorts of things like wilderness and building, not quite the same. Cover and shovel. So or design and maintain. Those sorts of things might not leap out as a rhyme, but they're calculated to create some of that same sense of pattern and structure without being too obviously sing-song and too neat and implausible. So there's something rather brilliant about that. And she talks about all of these poets who've done some of these things. I think it's in this book that I read that Paul Muldoon, the Irish poet Paul Muldoon, likes it when people at readings say, why don't you use poetry? And actually, if you look at Paul Muldoon's poems, there are many, many of them that have subtle rhymes all over the place, and it's very patterned. So he's pleased that people haven't actually noticed. Talks about how poetry is kind of like a machine for working out what you think. There's a nice quote from Seamus Heaney, the late Nobel winner. Part of my pleasure, said Heaney, was in thinking that the subject had not, as far as I knew, been treated in a poem. And so you've got quotes in here from Nobel Prize winning poets, and also from the author's mother, a skeptical scientist who was dragged to her first poetry reading, she says, and said afterwards, "I see the point of poets now, they notice things." And the author says, "A modern culture needs modern poems to reflect its changing self to itself freshly." And that's really true. Poetry sort of slightly step out of time, even when it's talking about something very kind of relevant and timely. So she talks about political things that have happened and why people might change the way that they use poetry, how they might have written poets about Thatcherism, how we might steal ideas from advertising or film. Poetry is about the personal mattering in public. It's quite a good line. In its own frail but stubborn level, it challenges controlling public perceptions merely by existing and being shared. And then this is a really funny thought, because where I live, poetry is easily ignored and not important. But this is all in a section on censorship and the weirdnesses and distortions of communist era Eastern Europe. In their moves against all freedom of expression, repressive regimes target poetry first. And Padel talks about how poets would type copies of each other's poems, memorize poems, get their families to memorize them, and write them on bars of soap in prison. So for poets writing in Europe, in Britain today, it's an aesthetic choice to avoid the obvious. But in Russian and Eastern European poetry at that time, you had to avoid the obvious to save your life. So in a funny way, so what her historical overview does is it shows that people in, as it were, safe countries could learn from the artistry used by people in unsafe countries, and then incorporate that into our own poetry so that we might become a bit oblique and so on. The most mundane little object takes on intense significance if you place it out there for other people to see against a background of surveillance and menace. Like a child's toy placed in the path of a tank, the object in poems became a statement about vulnerability and the power that threatened it. I guess it might be coming across that this book really made me feel excited about the importance and the power of poetry. And so then she moves on from talking about the Soviet era to talking about Northern Ireland and the Irish poets who probably incorporated, at the time of the violent troubles in Northern Ireland, incorporated some of those artistic ways of avoiding stating the obvious. In the 1970s in Belfast, poems came from a place where, in Seamus Heaney's words, whatever you say nothing. So it was necessary, even in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to avoid certain types of utterance. It remains the case. I mean, even in any society, there's always going to be something taboo that people want to say that they can't say because no one will let them say it. So you have to find a way around it. And poetry is a great device for that. Right, I'm getting in a little bit of notification, so I hope that hasn't come through and spoiled everything. Right, so there we go. Right, I ought to probably read a poem, but I don't have copyright, so maybe I can't. She goes on to talk about how poetry now includes all sorts of different tones of voice, dialogue, dialect, words that won't be comprehensible to everyone, whereas in the past it was all that you've got to talk official standard English. Now you can bung in all sorts of things from wherever you come from, and it seems more accommodating to that. And then she talks about women. I guess this must have been the bit that hit me, this section here on women. How do men read? Think technical, think male. So in this section, I suppose that must be where it suddenly hit me that there was something quite male about the way that I'd been formed in my reading. And I don't beat myself up for being a terrible patriarch, but I do think that I can learn something from noticing more about how I might be limiting myself and being narrow-minded. So I quite like to try and work that out. She quotes Sean O'Brien, who's a male poet, who in his book said, well, she says, in his book, he was one of the first to tackle the question of why male readers bristle at some women's poems. Male reviewers of Salima Hill, for instance, complain of whimsy and triviality. So I thought, oh, that's a bit of a challenge. I'd better have a look at that. So it was some of this thing by Carol Ann Duffy. Made me just think, I've got to find out more about this stuff. And then I just read some of the poems. Yeah, this was a really challenging sentence. She talked about how in the early 1870s, British lawyers, bankers, doctors and their families devoured modern poetry, just as their equivalents today queue for exhibitions at the big museums. Tennyson, Meredith, William Morris, Swinburne, Oscar Wilde, all those poets knew that they had a big audience of professionals, those kind of lawyers, doctors, bankers, and so on. And then she says, today, that's gone. Most professionals, even if they studied English at university, as I did, do not open a book of poems by a living author from one year's end to the next. God. Most people who read the Booker Prize-winning novels and the latest well-reviewed biography never buy a book of poems. Most college-educated people and the wider literary community see poetry as elitist, irrelevant, and obscure. That's terrible. Poetry is so good. Gosh. Anyway. Yeah. I'm being deliberately slow and not saying anything much on Twitter because I don't Twitch, sorry. Because I don't think you have to constantly be talking. Hang on. I think many people today feel they simply haven't got enough reading attention left over at the end of a working day to face a book of poems. You can't speed read a poem. You either read it properly or not at all. She talks about the problem of the media wanting poets to be interesting, but not really being very interested in the poem as such. And I get that. So for that reason, poetry doesn't really get much coverage in papers and on the media. I've done a lot of interviews on the BBC radio. Oh, this is actually a really good point. I've done a lot of interviews on the radio, probably about like 9 or 11 or something. And that's brilliant. I'm really grateful to the tireless, energetic, delightful Emily, who does all the publicity for my book, and got me all those interviews to do. But it's interesting because nearly all the interviews want to talk to me about my having a breakdown, which is obviously the background to my book. It's not obviously, because if you don't know anything about it, it is the background to my writing my book. The book is about coming out of a breakdown, and this drawing is the view from the window in my psychiatric hospital. But it's all about trying to be human and find comfort and a place to feel good and bad feelings. Yeah, it's all there. That's all me. Anyway, so the thing is, I did this interview and I did all these interviews, and the person who left me the 1-star review on Amazon actually said something about how she'd heard something on the radio about how this was a good book and it wasn't what she wanted, so she didn't like it, so she's taking it away to a charity shop. So perversely, weirdly, what I suppose I'm trying to say is that Ruth Padel's point about poets have to be interesting. I have to be interesting. I have to talk about having a breakdown. The radio station, bless them, thank you so much for having me on. Obviously, they don't really want me to just sit there reading poems and talking about the poems. They want to talk about my life story, my breakdown. So I get that. That's just the way the world is. And I guess they're like that because the listeners don't want to hear it. It's not the radio's fault. Um, right. So anyway, it's a brilliant introduction. It's 57 pages long. It's like a really good, like, well, actually, start at the beginning. It's from page 9 to page 57. So it's not 57 pages. Do the maths. And the motivation at the end is pretty good. Responding is what matters, responding to a poem. The reader's unconscious as well as conscious mind is at work when you react to the poem, just as the poet's conscious and unconscious thoughts work together in making it. Somehow, readers have just not been told that they can enjoy in poems all the wit, irony, comedy, imagination, obliquity that they take for granted in a film. A Spanish writer called Borges, famous writer, you may have heard of him, you may not have done, doesn't matter. Borges said, a poem is completed by the reader. It does not exist until it is read. I really get that, really get that. And so then she goes into the poems, and there's a really nice mix. There are lots of Irish poets, which is great. There's one by a woman called Rita Ann Higgins, who I'd never heard of until I picked up this book. It's got a swear word in it, so I won't read it, but it's great. It's one sentence, and apparently it's really popular in schools, because perhaps because it's got this swear word in it, but also because it's just really powerful and heartfelt and funny and kind of hurt. You've got to read it. It's a poem called Rita. It's called Some People, and her name is Rita Ann Higgins. But anyway, I'm not here to review the poem. I'm here to talk about this book. So I have said that, and so now I'm going to go onto Amazon and screen share and write this review. How do I do that? Well, I know how to do it, but I'm just going to do it. Amazon, Ruth, Padel, 52 ways. Okay, 52 ways. It's got 93 reviews. It's in stock. I will screen share in a sec. Oh yeah. So I've made the page look really huge. Right now, screen share. Can I do this? Will it work? What's going on? Okay. What happens? Can I no, I won't do anything about that. Okay, 52 ways of looking at a poem. I'm going to follow Ruth Padel because I think she's great. Where do I go for the reviews? 93 ratings. Write a customer review. I think it's 5-star. What's most important to know? Um, explains what the fuss is all about. Makes poetry seem fun. Shows poetry to be both important and enjoyable. It explains what all the fuss is about. Shows poetry to be both. Okay. Add a photo or video. People like that. Now, how am I going to do that? Okay. This is going to take a moment or two because I've got to do a workaround here. Um, Okay, taking the picture, send the picture to my Mac. Let's the sound off. Save the picture. Add the picture. I first found this book in somebody else's house. It was an Air, how do you spell it? Airbnb? Yeah, something like that. He had a lot of poetry, as I do. I dived in and it revealed to me that and it was startling. I thought I was quite up on poetry, but this showed me several gaps. I was particularly challenged and delighted by the introduction, which is almost a manifesto for poetry. It's persuasive. It makes a case for poetry's importance, but never loses sight of the sheer thrill of good poetry, the entertainment value. What most startled me was the challenge, was the sheer range and abundance of poets writing in English today. Was the sheer abundance of poets writing in English today and the range of their interests and techniques. I went home and bought my own copy. If you look at the picture, you can see that it's quite knackered from being well read and dropped in the bath. Oops. Since buying the book, I've gone to buy. Oh yeah, gosh, she says it herself. So it's not just me, a male reader. To me, the crucial poets at school, says Ruth Padel, female, whose work I learnt by heart were Shakespeare, Tennyson, Keats, Donne, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and T.S. Eliot. Then out of school came Louis MacNeice, Geoffrey Hill, Thomas Wyatt, Basil Bunting, Yeats, Auden, all becoming obsessingly important to me in turn. Only much later did I meet the work of Sylvia Plath, Elizabeth Bishop, Anna Akhmatova. It seems amazing to me now, says Ruth Padel, but I simply did not notice, just as I didn't when reading essential essays about poetry, that these writers were men. I was reading as if I were male, thinking male, when I was not. I found that so exciting and challenging for her to say that. Feels slightly apologetic, saying all this, like, why would I care? Because I'm a man and I ought to love the patriarchy. But how do I explain why I don't? How do I explain that? I don't know. I just find it quite exciting. So carrying on with my review, like jumping back, I have subsequently bought copies of books of poetry by many of the individual poets in this book. I have been enormously influenced by them and by Padel. Is that great? All anthologies quickly turn into fossils. I'm writing this review 18 years after the book first came out. I'm sure that selection might be different today, and the people quoted on the back of the book would be different too. But I'm sure the Glasgow Herald would still write correctly. A gift for any student or poetry virgin who wonders what all the excitement is about. Okay, that'll do. Right, submit. Dun, dun, dun. Processing your review. This may take several days. I rather doubt it. Anyway, thanks for watching this Twitch. Bye.